Hey y'all, I'm back and today we're going to be talking all about moss. I'll show you how to take an atlas sheet from Quixel's Megascans of all these little moss strands, how to set up the geometry and prepare for scatter, and then we're going to reproduce this scene that I have up in front of me just to demonstrate the techniques of using these atlases. Now all the assets that I've used in this scene are from Megascans, so I will leave links to all the various assets in the description below so you can actually use the exact assets that I'm using here. So to start, before I even jump in here, there's some preparation that we have to do with the atlas to prepare these little moss strands before we get into it. So I think that's where we'll start, and then once we have those prepared and ready, we'll jump into this scene. We'll kind of figure out what's going on in here. So I'm going to jump over into Maya, Moss Demo, and there are a few ways that I've seen to create geometry for these kind of atlas sheets. All of them are frankly tedious, and I've tried a few, and I think the method that I do in Maya is it's certainly tedious, but I feel like the meshes, you have better control over the output mesh of the strands. There's some alternatives in Houdini and ZBrush. If you search around, you can find those, and if they suit you, great, but I will show you how I do it in Maya. So I'm going to start with, and in this specific scene, I've used 3 different types of moss for variety. I'll show you how to do the setup on one specific type, and then you can take it from there to do some others. So I took this specific thing, and again there's I'll leave a link in the description of which specific one this is. So I'm in Quixel Bridge right here. I found the moss that I want, and I downloaded all the maps, and for atlases there is no geometry associated, you just get the texture maps. So that's our job, to create the geometry. So I'm going to open up Maya. I'm going to create a plane, scale it up a bit, 5, rotate it 90 degrees because we want our moss to be facing up. I'm going to go into the front view, and then there's a few things that we got to do to set this up. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to load in a texture, and this is going to be the albedo of the moss that we're working with here. So then I'm going to pipe it into a PXR surface as the color. I'm going to apply it to this, and we can see on the screen what we get here. So we get all these little strands of moss. Now it's because the albedo map actually blends the colors throughout the rest of the map, it's a little hard to see the borders. So what I actually like to do at the start is load the opacity map, and this gives you a much cleaner, easier to read texture map. So what we're going to do is, the end result is to have a very low subdiv model of each one of these strands. And it's kind of tedious, so put on a good playlist and just kind of hammer through it. But once you get it done for one atlas sheet, save it off and you can reuse it again and again. So it's a little time you invest in the beginning, and you can pay dividends down the road. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to subdivide this a certain amount till I get kind of what I'm after here. So what I like is basically 3 subdivisions width on the moss itself. I want one edge going down the center. That way I can do some bending of the moss, and it will bend appropriately down the center. And then a few subdivisions on the the height wise, again, for bending and deforming there. So if I do this 24 subdivisions on this poly plane, seems like it will do what I'm after. So basically what I found to be one of the easier approaches is now I'm just going to mash the vertexes around these pieces and then cut the faces out. So let's get started. So if we go into vertex mode and say I want this center line to be the center line of this moss, I'm going to take this vert and stretch it over, but you'll see we're actually stretching the UVs when we do that. That is not what we want. So to get around that, you go into the tool settings. I just double clicked on the move tool. There's a preserve UVs checkbox. If you click that and now we move this again, you'll see that the UVs stay roughly the same, yet I can still move the vertices around. And the reason I do this is because we want the UVs to stay consistent. I've seen other approaches where you use a create polygon tool and kind of trace around it, but then the UVs are messed up and you have to actually manually align the UVs, and that's no fun. So anyway, preserve UVs is on, and I'm just going to kind of massage some verts around. I just want a couple of subdivisions width and then a few along the height. I'm just tracing around. Doesn't have to be perfect. But in the world of ray tracing, it is more expensive to trace through a face and calculate opacity than it is, obviously, when you're hitting the opaque part of the texture. So we want it tight, like that, something like this. Then we go to face mode, and I'm going to do a mesh tools, no, it's edit mesh, duplicate, and right away I'm going to delete the history. And when you do a duplicate face, it creates a group underneath of the plane and then the faces. I'm just going to hit Shift P, and that just removes it from the parent. So here's our plane, and then here's our little piece of algae or moss. So at this point, it's just rinse and repeat. I mean, that only took a matter of seconds to do. I mean, there's a lot of pieces of moss on this sheet. You can choose to do all of them or some of them, but it's just a kind of just hammer it out. It doesn't take very long, and the end result, you'll get some nice realistic moss pieces that you can scatter and get really nice results. So I'm just going to keep doing this. I'll do a few. I've gone through and done this whole sheet already, so I'll just demonstrate here the approach I have. So that looks good. And one thing about the center line, we want it to be centered with the stem of the moss. Again, for deformation purposes. We don't want it to be deforming, say, over here. That wouldn't make any sense. Okay, that looks good. Same thing, duplicate, delete the history, Shift P to unparent, and then I'm actually going to start a group here with my moss so I can keep the little pieces separate. And here's my plane. So I'll go ahead and do a few more just for the sake of demonstration. The other approaches I've seen have been more procedural, but the mesh itself, the resulting mesh, say if you do it in the ZBrush and mask out the alpha and whatnot, you have kind of a messy mesh that's got to be decimated, and it may not matter, but I feel like the deformations on a mesh like that aren't going to be as clean. So I do prefer doing it this way. Again, center line. Grab this, duplicate face, delete the history, Shift P, I'm going to grab this, group it, and I'll do one more, and we'll kind of leave it up to you to do what you need from there. But this is rinse and repeat. It's kind of rewarding at the end if you've gone through a lot of work to create an asset that's just works really well, looks good, scatters well. I feel like there's a sense of almost pride in setting these things up yourself. I did hear that Quixel is working on a way to provide base geometry with their atlases, which would be great, even if they're just flat. and we can just kind of deform them from there. That would be a huge time saver. So maybe this will be obsolete before we know it. Duplicate face, delete history, Shift P to deep, on parent. Okay, so here's our plane, and then we have 4 moss pieces that we've left. So you just repeat for the rest of the moss, but for now I'll just show you how these will be set up here. So I'm going to go to object mode. I'm going to center the pivots. The pivot is very important. When you're using Maya's mesh, it uses the pivot of the geometry as the scatter point. So we want the pivot to be at the base of the moss. And now on some of these, the base might be up here, not all the way at the bottom. So in order to really demonstrate what I'm talking about, I am going to load the albedo back up. We can see this. So in this case, the base is something like right in here, even though the geometry goes down to this. Same for this, it's a little higher. So you think of, if you're scattering it on a surface, where do you want the moss to be above the surface? And it's going to be here. You don't want it to be like this little strand. There's the surface and then the strand comes up. So to change the pivot, you're going to hold down the D key, and then you can drag it from there as I'm holding down the D key. And that's where I want there. Hold down the D key. I want the base to be there. Again, D key down here. And I feel like this, now that I have the albedo visible, I can see that really this center line should probably be more aligned with the center of the moss. So I'll go back to object. I still like that pivot though. And then this, holding down D, the base there. Excellent. So we have 4 pieces of moss. Now, if you were to go and take and scatter these pieces of moss right now, it will look good, but it wouldn't look great. And reason being, they are perfectly flat. They're planar. So depending on the camera angle, you might not see the moss. And we want to change that. We want to apply some deformations, so at any angle that you see, you get actual, visibility. It's not like just flat cards. So to do that, I'm going to take these are very low res. I'm going to actually subdivide them once just to help with the deformations. Subdivided. So then let's take this for example, and I want to actually do a bend, maybe a few different bends to make this non-planar. So if you go up to the animation toolkit here, you go deform, non-linear, bend. That applies a deformer to that piece of geometry. Now by default, it's not oriented correctly. I want it to be lengthwise with the piece of geometry. So I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. And I don't know which way in the x-axis it is, so I am going to just apply a bit of curvature and just see what's going on. So we don't want it to bend this way. I was hoping to bend it, front or back. So that means I need to rotate this handler 90 degrees one more time. 90 degrees. And I'm going to back off on that curvature a little bit. And then for me, I want the base to be straight and then the curvature to taper toward the top. And we can do that by changing the bounds. So I'm going to change the high bound to something even 0. I can move this down a little bit. And again, we can bend and curve the moss how we see fit, more or less randomly. We don't in no specific way it should be, just something that's non-planar. And that's where those extra subdivisions come into play. If I hadn't have subdivided it, you'd get a real faceted result. So I do that, maybe there, and then I will actually do that again by hitting the G key. It'll apply another bend deformer. And I want one that's widthwise, so I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. I feel like that's not 90. I missed it. If you hold down the J key, it constrains it to I think 15 degrees rotations. So here's my second bend. I'm going to apply a little curve there, and I want it to be this way. So you can kind of see what's going on. It's wider than I want. Just kind of want it to be part of the geometry. And then something like that. So right away, just looking at this with two bend deformers, that is 100% more realistic than this, for example, if you were to scatter this and that. Now, just taking a step back, I'm only doing this for 4 pieces of moss. If you pull up that sheet, there's, I don't know, 30, 40 pieces of moss on this. And if you really want variety, you're going to want to do this on multiple atlas sheets to get some variety of the moss. Applying bend deformers one by one is a very time-consuming thing. So I'm going to share a script with y'all. I'll post it down below in the description, how we can do this automatically. I wrote a little Python script that does just this, just what I had been doing on this one. So you select the geometry you want. We're going to do a sideways bend, a length bend, and a length twist, and it uses some randomness so they're not all the exact same, and just kind of deforms them in ways that makes it look a little more realistic. So I just selected those 3, ran the script, and we see our result. You know, maybe this one's a little bit too much curvature there. I can back it off manually if I need to, but in general, this one's got a nice little twist to it. It might even be able to do a little more twist. Go to the twist, and we can kind of finagle it from there. But the whole point of this is just to make it so they're non-planar. It'll scatter so much better. And your results will be so much more robust by doing this. So again, I'll share that script. It's a simple Python script, and just grab your geometry, run it, and just get a little bit more realism to your pieces of geometry here. So, all right, so we're not done quite yet in preparation. So we've done some cool things. We've created the geometry, subdivided, deformed. Now to prepare them for scatter, I'm going to go back to the front view. I'm going to grab my pieces of geo, delete the history. We don't want any of the deformers linked to it. And we actually want these at the origin, the 0, 0 origin. So what I can do is, with all of them selected, hold down the X key, and that's going to constrain my movement to the grid and drag them all to the center, right, 0, 0. So they're all stacked and ready to go that way. Now, if I were to apply a mesh network to this, they would scatter appropriately. Of course, you have to freeze transforms. Don't want to forget that. So they're zeroed out at the origin, ready for scatter. Now, one thing that you may want to do beforehand, you can do this in the scene that you're using them, or you can do them beforehand, is set up your shader as well. So then you can just have this moss ready to import into any scene you want. The shader's ready, good to go. So I just spaced them out one more time so we can actually see what the shader is going to look like. So let's just view the shader. So in a previous tutorial I had done Megascans to RenderMan, I showed you how to set up shaders using Megascans assets. So all I've done is taken the maps provided for the atlas and hooked it up into a material that we can use. And if I apply that, we can see it's gotten a little darker because I'm using ACES in this particular example. But the shading network is basic. We have our albedo, ambient occlusion multiplied over the albedo, our opacity. We have our transmit color, that is the subsurface color, our specular, and our roughness, and our normal. So I'm just basically plugging it all into a PXR surface, and ready to go here. So if I just do a viewport render for RenderMan, we can kind of see how things are looking. Now we see some splotchiness here, and this is good that to demonstrate here. That's likely a displacement bound issue, but overall these are looking good. So what I can do is I can grab this geometry, F4, oh that's a hotkey of mine actually. So this is just the attribute spreadsheet. I have a hotkey to F4. Go over to RenderMan. I actually do want to subdivide these even more because I'm displacing. But if I scroll over to, there's a displacement bound. I'm just going to bump this up to maybe 0.5, and you can see those holes go away. We can maybe try reducing it 0.3. No, still have the holes. So 0.5. You want it to be as low as it can be, but definitely don't want any cracks or issues there. So you can see with all the deformations, if I scroll like to the, or I pan to the side here, you can see they actually still hold up from the side, whereas if they were planar, I wouldn't see anything at this point. So this is a good way to set up your moss in a separate scene. Again, it's kind of tedious, but once you set it up, it's good to go. You can use it in any of your scenes, and having the shader all set up and ready in this is beneficial as well. So I'm going to kill that viewport render. I'm going to take these all back to the origin. Then what I would recommend doing at this point is taking the group and doing export selection. Just do moss export. I'm going to save it to this particular asset, and then I would save it as a Maya binary. That'll bring in your RenderMan, it'll save your RenderMan materials along with your geometry, so when you import it, you're good to go. You're hit the ground running. So anyway, that's how I would set those up. Now in this particular example, and I'll post again the asset IDs in the description. I used 3 different moss sheets. This was the main one that I had done. I did most of the moss sheets there, and I actually have them in this scene, so you can see here's all the ones that I had picked to do. So you can see exact same process, and if I go like to the side, there's some good variety there. And if I were to again launch a render, you can see they hold up very well from any angle, even that. So that's kind of the goal here. Okay, so I'll post the asset links here. There's 3 sheets that I did. You can pick and choose what moss fits for you. There's a lot more atlases out there on Megascans that you can leverage. We'll go from there. So with that, after this cut, we'll go over to Maya and see what the other scene is looking like. All right, we're over in Maya in the scene that we're going to be doing our scatter for the moss. And I'll just give you a little breakdown of what's going on before we start scattering so you're a little more familiar. So here's the camera angle. I've chosen a very long lens to have a very tight focus on the statue here. Focal length of 200 and f-stop of 2.8, so we're very narrow depth of field. So if I come out of this, we can see it's just a handful of assets, very simple. I again will leave a link to everything that I'm using in the description. It's all Quixel assets. So for example, the main assets that I'm going to be using for the scatter is the statue. So if I just search for it here, it's this one right here, this Roman statue. So what I like to do in my scenes, I'll pop this over real quick. These are actually alembic caches. They're not actual geometry loaded into the scene. And I like to do that because I like to use the high resolution mesh from Quixel. One thing that you can't do is scatter mesh or use mesh to scatter on alembic caches. So the reason I say that is when you're in Bridge and you're downloading the asset and say you want to scatter some moss on this, you can use the alembic cache as the rendering geometry, but you're going to have at least the LOD0 mesh as an FBX to use for the scatter. I can demonstrate that, what I mean, here in a minute. So anyway, download this high poly LOD0 again for scattering purposes, and these are the maps that I use for rendering the high polys. The roughness, normal bump, specular, cavity, and albedo. I don't need anything else. So download that, and along with, I did some moss scatter on this back wall, so if I pull up the end result, there is some moss here behind the head itself. I'll leave that up to you. I won't actually need to do that in this demonstration, but again, you'd want to download the FBX of the LOD0 to scatter, and then if you want the high poly source, sorry, my nuke is wigging out a little bit, but I was just trying to zoom in to show you the moss on the actual rock back here. Anyway, so back into here. So these are all just caches. These are some ferns, a few other plants, and so the staircase and the ground. So these are literally all just straight from Quixel. Took the textures, didn't have to do anything. So one thing before I get started is, if we do a render, I'll just render the shot cam real quick. Let me make sure I'm not rendering 4K, which I am, which I don't need to. Let's go back to that, 1080. So if I render shot cam, we can see our starting point, and everything is just straight out of Megascans except for the statue, and we can see that here in a moment. We'll notice that the material on the statue does not match what is in Quixel. This is like a more of a clean marble look. I have retextured the head to have more of a like a lichen covered granite, as if you'd find it in the forest. So I took it into Substance Painter and again used a Megascan surface and just resurfaced the asset here to make it look like it's out in the jungle, and it would have moss growing on it, so it just made sense. So here's our starting point. Everything else is just stock out of Quixel, which is nice. And my goal is to scatter more on the top and in the crevices of the head itself. So if I pull up my main reference for this, let's go over to Pinterest, which is always my source of inspiration. It was this specific one that drew my attention. Statue, the moss was mainly on the top of the head, some on the back wall, and then kind of creeping down underneath a little bit. So that was just kind of my main inspiration for that, so that's kind of what I'm going for here. So to do that, I'm going to kill this render. We're going to do a collection of masks for our mesh networks. We're going to do a few different varieties of the moss that we demonstrated earlier in this video, just by changing the shading. So we're going to do some that's a little darker green, some that's kind of the base green, and some that's a little more yellow, and that'll add a nice variety and look a little more realistic. And then we're also going to throw in two more different kinds of moss that I mentioned earlier that I took from a different atlas sheet, and just kind of sprinkle it in to, again, add a little bit more realism there. So to start, the first thing I'm going to do here is, this is my Alembic cache, and then I have my level of detail 0 parented to it, or constrained to the Alembic cache, so I can actually do the moss scatter on this mesh, because like I said, you can't scatter on an Alembic cache. So this is just here and hidden, and I use that to drive my mesh scatter, and I'm rendering the high resolution high poly mesh from Quixel. So to do that, we're going to scatter. So I've imported, so earlier we exported a Maya file, a Maya binary of the moss already with its shader. I've imported that into the scene and it's ready to go. So here's all of the cards that I generated for that same atlas that we were working on earlier. I'm going to select all of them individually. I'm going to go over to the Mesh tab here. I'm going to open up the Mesh editor. I'm going to go create. Now, actually, if this is the first time you're creating a mesh network, you actually want to do this a different way. There's two different types of mesh networks. One is a, I guess, a method of duplication where it's actually creating a duplicate mesh for every instance, and there's one that's a instancer network, which is what we want. We want all of the MOS geo cards to be instanced over the surface of the geometry. It'll keep it more lightweight that way. So by default, it's actually a duplicative method. So we need to go over to the animation toolkit, mesh, create mesh network options, and by default it'll be a mesh. We want to change it over to instancer. So if I have all of my cards selected, hit apply, it will create, and I open up my editor again, a mesh network. I want to rename this mesh. This is just going to be my base green, and then I like to give a tag of what it is. So this is just going to be the Megascans ID that I'm getting from the geometry here, and it by default creates a distribute node. I want to distribute it on a mesh, and then it's going to take an input mesh as the target for the scatter. So for that, I'm going to find my level of detail that I was demonstrating earlier, middle click and drag over to that. So you'll kind of see a little bit of moss sticking through. And again, this isn't being driven by any sort of mask or map or anything. It's going to go over the entire surface. And if I drive this number up to, say, I don't know, 10,000, you can see we have moss. Let me just focus my view here. We have moss scattered on the head. There's a few things here that we noticed right out of the gate. One, they're all oriented the same. And two, they are all the same piece of geometry. Even though I have 38 cards, it's only scattering one. So we need to add a few more nodes here, one of which is an ID. And I'm going to set this to random. If you set it to linear, it's going to cycle through one at a time the entire quantity of the scattered geo. If I go random, it'll randomly select from the pool of instance geo, and we can see already we're getting better results. Orientation is all the same, which you still want to fix, but we're actually scattering all of the 38 cards that I have here. So now we're going to add some randomness. So you add a random node, and by default it adds a translation randomness, which I don't necessarily need. But what I want to do is add a random rotation 360 degrees around the axis, and then some random tilt in the other two axes, just to add some realism there. So for rotation Y, 360 degrees, so that it'll be able to be positioned and scattered in any rotation around the tall axis of the geo. And then I'm going to do something like 30 degrees in the other axis just for some tilt, and this is random, of course. And then the scale, I do like to randomize the scale some as well, just like in real life. All these pieces of moss aren't going to be the same size, so I'm going to uncheck absolute scale because I want it to actually be able to scale smaller and larger. If it's absolute, it's only going to get larger. So I'm going to turn that off. And then this is the, I guess, the random quantity that you want to be able to scale the geometry. I'm going to go 0.4. So that means it'll get 0.4, I guess this is 40% smaller up to 40% bigger. And uniform, I want it to be X, Y, and Z. I just want it to be as a whole. I don't want it to be stretched in any one direction or another. So right now we're actually looking better. All these are looking fairly random. We have different selections of the moss and they're all oriented differently. Now if we really want to demonstrate this randomness, if I do something like 10 here, well, maybe that's a little too crazy. If I do 5, you can see some are really small, some are really big. So you can get some really nice variety just by using this random node. I'm going to keep it more subtle than that. I'm going to go back down to like 0.4. We're looking good. So this is going to be the main base of my scatter. Now you'll notice when you're rendering, you're going to need a lot more than say what I have, 10,000. So we're going to do some testing with a lower quantity. Then when it's time to render, you can crank it up and do some tests. But the main thing here is we actually want to mask this out and constrain it to certain areas and not have it be across the entire mesh. So we can do that using a visibility node. So with the visibility node, we have the ability to plug in a mask, just a black and white map, that will tell the mesh network where to leave the scatter and where to, I guess, hide the scatter. So what we're going to do is, at this point, we need to actually create a mask. We don't have anything like that to drive off of. So my preferred method is I've taken the geometry and I have imported it over into Substance Painter to export a few different masks to use for this purpose. So I'm going to open up Substance. So here's my base color, like I was demonstrating. Then I have some masks that I've created up here for the different scatters. So really all I want is a black and white mask to drive the mesh. So I'm going to start from the bottom here. So here's my main mask that I'd like to drive the overall, I guess, the highest amount of the scatter. It mainly from the top, a little bit on the bottom, definitely in the crevices. And you can do this all in Maya with different noise and textures and various ways. I find doing it in Substance is easier and quicker. So after I do this, I've created, just using an MG mask builder, a mask that I like. Then you can right click, export mask to file. So you can export this. Now I've done this a few different times because we're going to do a few different scatters, and it's as easy as just creating different splotches and patterns and variety to emulate the randomness of nature and do some different areas for the scatter to be. So I'm just kind of clicking through some of the masks that I've created in Substance. Again, this is the main one that we're going to drive off of, and so on and so forth. So play around, create a mask, right click, export mask to file, and we can use that in Maya. So over in Maya, if I open up the, let's see, I need to open up the Hypershade. Let it load up for a moment. I have a helper map tab here. Here are the 5 masks that I just showed you in Substance that I've loaded in. So just load them in as normal Maya file textures. Mesh does not like PXR textures, so we need to keep it the file texture. So the main one, head moss mask, this is the first one that I showed you. This is just basically the top of the head. So what we can do, we actually want this to be wrong. So go open up the visibility node of your mesh network. Sometimes you have to toggle back and forth because mesh is a little bit buggy. So we're back in the visibility. So we need 2 things. We need a map helper. This tells the mesh network how to apply this texture that we're going to be plugging in. So in this case, I'm going to drag the LOD0 mesh. It's going to automatically go UV. It detects that it has UVs, and now I'm going to middle click and drag the strength map of the mask that I exported from Substance. So now it takes a second. We should see, and we don't have very much moss on there right now to really demonstrate, but we can see if I turn this off, it's down here underneath where we don't want it. If I turn it on, it's constrained to the top. Now if I crank up the amount of points, like a lot, 100,000, you'll see a better effect of what I'm talking about. So you'll see it is constrained to the mask that I exported from Substance Painter. So you'll see even in my viewport at 100 with 100K nodes, it's getting a little sluggish. So I do some tests, I see does it look good, and then I back down the amount of points, just for performance reasons. So actually, let's do a quick test render at 100K. And see where we're at this point. Okay, so open this up. Looking pretty good. Got some moss. It's looking good. Now I can tell we need a lot more of it, but in general it looks good so far. One thing you'll notice as well is the lack of variety. I know we've just done one scatter at this point, but you can really tell that it's all the same moss, all the same texture. So that's why we do multiple scatters to blend in some different shading varieties and some different moss types. So anyway, we're looking good. I would recommend at least 5 times what we have here. So I'm going to cancel this. I don't like to muck with mesh settings live on an IPR. Doesn't handle well typically, so I'm going to up the amount and then kick off another render and see what we get. Alright, so I upped the amount on the distribute node to 600K, and we're getting a much nicer result than at 100. You can see the difference. I didn't change anything else with the mask, I just upped the amount. So it is a little surprising how much you need. But when you're doing such fine detail, like little individual strands of moss, you need that extra detail to fill it out. So 100K, 600K. Sweet. This looks really good already. Just one single atlas sheet with one material, and this is our result. So I'm going to go through and do a few more scatters based off the different masks that I had in Substance Painter to get some variety. So I'm going to cancel this render. I'm going to take this back down to something reasonable. Actually, I am just going to hide this. So what I like to do when I'm doing multiple scatter is once I'm happy with something, hide it and get it out of the way so it doesn't impact my performance. So I've got some layers that I already created that I'm just going to add this instancer to this layer. READL2, again, that's just the ID from Quixel, and it's going to chug for a little bit. Okay, and it's hidden. So it's there, and when I want to render it, I just re-enable this layer. Hide these ones as well, and it's out of the way. Perfect. So we're going to do this whole process again. So to add variety here, so what I've done is I have, you'll notice these 3 moss READL2, that's the ID. I have 3 copies, or 2 copies of the original, and I also have copies of the original shader. So I have 3 of the exact same shader that I've copied, and then what I've ended up doing, like for example on the yellow version, in the albedo color correct, I've changed the saturation. On the green one, I've changed the hue a little bit, and then I have a darker one even. I go in the albedo, I change the hue even more, as well as the transmit color. just to add some variety. And on this one, the dark as well, I've added a PXR vary to the albedo with a very small amount of hue variety, just to again add a little bit more realism there. So I have 3 copies of the geo, 3 copies of the shader, and I'm going to do 3 different mesh scatters for each of those with different masks to add some variety. So let's do it. So I'm going to do the yellow. I'm going to grab all of this, create mesh network, and after you've done it, created an instancer mesh network from the settings, it will stick. So now I can just go create, and it'll be an instancer by default. Mesh yellow. Cool. Mesh. Again, I'm going to drag the statuette there. I'm going to start at 10,000 just to see what's going on. ID node. And realistically, you could probably copy paste the previous network and just change the distribute geometry or the instancer. But this doesn't take very long to go through and do anyway. Do a random. Pretty much the exact same. So 30-degree tilt, 360-degree rotation, 30-degree tilt, and then a 0.4 uniform scale variety there. Cool. And then a visibility node. One of the cool things about the visibility node that I'm not using in this case, because almost the entire statue is in the camera frustum, is you can cull scattered points based off the frustum of the camera. So if, for example, if I have a field and lots of grass, the visibility node has the ability with frustum filtering to delete everything outside the camera frustum. So a little tip there. I'm not using it in this case, but something to keep in mind. Alright, I'm dragging the statue there, and now the other mask, the yellow, is this guy. So a little more splotchy. I think what I ended up doing here is using the exact same mask as the green, but then I've multiplied over a black and white clouds layer, so it's just kind of intertwined in the other mask. So with the yellow, let's go there. Again, this should be raw. Okay. All right, and again, I just think we'll likely need a lot more. I'm gonna crank this, so this is 10K. Let's go 400K. All right, so we can see kind of that splotchiness there. So if I'll go ahead and do the other scatter before running a test render, but we can see that this is going to add some nice variety. So same with this. I'm going to add this new scatter instancer, the yellow, to my layer just to hide it as I work on the other ones. Now, one thing I do want to point out is on the distribute node, down in the advanced, there's a batch render multiplier. So this will, like it sounds, multiply the number of points when you're doing a batch render. So you can interactively test with much fewer points for performance, and then set this to something like 10 or 100 depending on how much you've reduced it interactively, and it will apply those number of points to a batch render. So keep that in mind, that option is there. Interactively, I like to see what's going on, and then once I'm iterating, say I'm iterating on the stairs or the back, and I don't want the weight of all of this mesh when I'm not iterating on it, I can set this batch multiplier. So that's there. All right, we're going to continue on here. A few more scatters. We're going to do a dark scatter. It has more of a dark green hue to it. And this is going to be literally the same thing. So mesh, scatter on that. Let's start with 10,000 just to see what's going on. ID random. Alright, and one thing to know about this, I intended for the dark ones to be darker green, a little more, I guess, healthy living. So I took the base geo of the scatter and I have scaled it up by 2. So it's actually going to be twice as big as the other scatter. So it'll actually stick out a little bit as well. Just all the more variety you can add to add the realism. Alright, so we need one more thing. We need the visibility mask. Map helper. Alright, and then the map we're using for this is going to be this one, which is again just built on the base mask. Then I've multiplied some clouds with some more clouds, and then I've boosted it with the levels just to kind of get some more contrast. So this is the mask for that, and that is the most dark, that one. Okay, hit that save button. Right. So one thing we can also do here is in the color balance, you can add exposure to it here. So say out of substance or whatever, it isn't contrasty enough or it's not bright enough, you can boost this exposure up to reveal more of that mask. So I just have it set at 1 here. Okay, so that's looking good. Again, just need more of it. So I think for this, 300,000. And these are numbers that I had to finesse and play with and find a balance from my previous tests. Start small and increase as needed, of course. Okay, so that looks good. So right from there, I'm going to enable the others. We're going to run a test. So I'm going to add this to my layer again. So it's going to disappear, then I'm going to enable the layer and run a test. Okay, and this is going to take a moment because we have, 1.5 million points here. So I'm just going to pause for a sec. Okay, we're back. So all of the mass is loaded on here. I'm going to start a render. And despite being instances, it still really bogs down Maya having this much. So you just have to work smart. So I'm going to kick off a render just to see where we're at. I'm going to pause it. Alright, we're back. I've sent off a render. Come back with a few iterations, and already I can see the variety here. So if I go back, this is what we had before with just the base scatter. And this is what we have now. So if I just toggle back and forth, you can see huge difference. So we have these yellow areas kind of where the moss may have dried up through here, down and around here, and then we have these darker green areas where it's actually a little bit bigger, where maybe the moss is a little more healthy, it contains more water. So it's huge difference. I mean, this alone looked pretty decent. Adding this is another level. Now I have a few more moss varieties that I could throw in and scatter for a little bit more, and I'm going to do that. It's the same exact process, so I'm just going to pause it and come back with another render and see where we're at that point. Alright, we're back. I added 2 more mesh scattering networks for 2 different mosh atlases, very scarcely. So just to revise, the masks that I used were just a few kind of spots, different spotty ones. Just I wanted it very scarce. And you can see they're a little darker. I have some red in them. So if I go back and forth, this was the render before, this is after. You can just kind of see some variety. And I think if you study reference, you'll notice that's the biggest thing, is it's just there's so much variety in this kind of thing. So I mean, you can keep going and going and going and add more and more different types, and I think you'd probably, I mean, the more the better. But anyway, that's, I think, where we'll stop with the head. I'm very happy with that. I think a total of 5 mesh networks, 3 using the same exact geometry, and then 2 just very sparse accessory ones. Now kill this render. Now in the final image that I had, I had some moss scattered on the rock behind it. So it's the same exact process, and my nuke is struggling right now. Basically what I did, I can demonstrate that, is I'm going to open up the rock face, I believe. So this is what I did. So I exported the the LOD 0 for the rock face and the LOD 0 for the statue head into Substance, so I can do this ambient occlusion kind of area right here. So again, I noticed in my reference on the contact point of the statue there was some moss growing there, so that's kind of what I was sort of going to emulate. So if I hide that, we can see this is our contact point, and all I did basically was take a brush and do some painting in here with the ambient occlusion, kind of to simulate that. So I exported that as a mask and imported that the same exact way, same setup for the mesh network, and just use that to drive the scatter. I guess one thing to note with that, I'm going to hide some of this. This is the 2 accessory scatters that I just did, so you can see how scarce they are, but they do, I think, make a nice difference. So one thing to point out here is this is a kind of a large asset. So to scatter, the way the mesh networks work, if I open this back up, you're distributing over the entire mesh, and then only at the end are you hiding parts of that via a mask. So if you consider something like this whole piece of geometry where I only want some moss right here, the density of those points, it would have to be absurd, like 1,000,000 or more, to cover the entire rock face and then just mask out this little part. Honestly, it's to me a flaw in how the mesh system works. So what I ended up doing is I took the LOD 0 mesh and I deleted everything except this little part. I probably could have trimmed it even more. And that way the density of the mesh network can be reduced greatly, the point density, and then the moss appears right here. So I'm not going to demonstrate that. It's the same exact mesh network. Just plug in the mask for that. Okay, so that's that. And then just, I guess, the quick final composite here. I did a fog layer as usual, and I think this is something that is invaluable in all aspects of CG, is just have some sort of atmosphere, some sort of fog. Again, this isn't the basis of this tutorial here, but set up a fog layer, and looks like this. apologies for the incredible slowness here. But so here's my fog, just a little bit, doesn't have to be much, and I colored it, I graded it kind of blue and mask it over. So here's the raw, here's the fog, and then I do a little chromatic aberration and vignette, and there's our final piece. So I think in a relatively short amount, I guess the most time consuming part of this whole thing is just gathering the geometry for the moss atlases. But once you've done it once, you've done it. So now if I want to do another scene with moss, that's already done. I can just do the mesh networks, and it's great that way. So anyway, I think that's all I'm going to cover. Thank you for following along. And of course, if you enjoyed this, if you learned from it, hit the like button. It helps us out. And if you have any questions, concerns, suggestions, or just want to say what's up, hit me up in the comments section below. Again, happy rendering. Talk to you next time.